I didn't think it was gonna be this bad, but holy, did she really go there? Did she really go from having a trans kid is worse than 9/11 to having a trans kid is worse than genocide?
It is the most difficult and devastating experience they've had in their lives.
Having a trans kid? What if you were just like supportive?
I'm talking about parents who may have gone through cancer, financial ruin, divorce.
Oh, she's saying that having a trans kid is worse than financial ruin and divorce and cancer. Okay, wow. Wow.
9/11.
Wait, having a trans kid is worse than 9/11? Crazy psychiatrist, Dr. Grossman, whose entire, I guess, practice these days is dedicated towards hating queer people and also being opposed to sex education. She also appeared on the What is a Woman documentary. She has a book called You're Teaching My Child What?
Have you seen this, Naomi?
A physician exposes the lies about sex ed and how they harm your child. Literally all available evidence and studies we have shows that sex education teaches kids how to have safer sex, prevents abortions, it prevents teen pregnancy, and it actually causes kids to start having sex at a later age than they would if they were taught abstinence only. When teenagers are properly taught the risks and the how-tos, they're more likely to wait until they feel ready for sex. These all seem like benefits for me. Teen pregnancy, bad. Although, I mean, the Matt Walsh side has quite explicitly advocated for teen pregnancy, so long as they're married. Don't want to strawman Matt Walsh's position. Dr. Grossman, maybe that's why, like, she got into the transphobic grift. Like, she hated being called a gross man so much. I need to end the transgenders, or end transgenderism. That way people don't laugh at me for being a gross man. I don't know.
Is there such a thing as gender?
I do think that gender is real, because we live in a society that cares about it.
Okay.
We can talk about language and how a certain lexicon that has been created by this social movement and this vocabulary has been forced upon us.
That's a crazy way to answer the question, is gender real?
Let me first go to the biology.
The question was about gender, not sex, but yes, biological sex is real. Easy peasy, slam dunk. Next question. Gender as a social phenomenon is also real.
So we are mammals. Mammals are dimorphic in terms of their sex. There's two sex.
The sex I had with your mom and the sex I had with your dad.
Male and female. And the way that that is determined, whether a person is male or female, is you look at their reproductive systems and you see whether that reproductive system is organized around creating sperm or eggs.
Okay, so she's going with the gametes definition of sex. Even the gametes definition of sex has intersex people who exist. People who, by that definition, would actually be both sexes or perhaps neither sex. No matter what definition they're going to give you of biological sex, it's not going to be binary, because none of the sex characteristics fit into this clean dyadic unit of male and female. So there are some intersex people who have actually literally produced both sperm and eggs. Ovulation in a cytogenetically proved phenotypically male, fertile. This has been known in the medical literature for a very long time. Also, there are some intersex people who don't really have developed reproductive capacities in either direction. They're just going to be infertile. What would this person's sex be? Like, under her definition, this person would have to be both sexes because their reproductive system was organized to produce both. There are a couple intersex conditions that can cause this. One is having ovotesticular syndrome. Essentially what this is instead of having just ovaries or just testicles, you either have a combination or a hybrid, where some of these people have like one ovary and one testicle. Some of them have what's known as ovotestes that are kind of in between ovaries and testicles. This can also happen with XXXY chimerism, where essentially you have some cells in your bodies that are like XX chromosomes and develop more in the female direction. You have some cells in your bodies that are XY chromosomes, develop more in the male direction, like as a fetus in utero. And so people with XXXY chimerism can have quite literally any combination of reproductive organs, external genitalia, internal genitalia. It just depends on like which parts of their body developed from which set of chromosomes. Very fascinating, like super cool. And I don't know why like they want to deny the science or deny that these people exist or deny that they have unique medical needs, unique biological functions because of them being intersex. Sure, intersex people are rare, but they're still real and they still exist. Just because, you know, an exception is rare, like that still shows that something isn't binary. Like, binary means only ever two outcomes. Like, in computer binary, we don't get a 0.5 some of the times. Like, that's not binary. There's also the hydrogen-helium analogy, where 99.9% of atoms in the universe are either hydrogen or helium, yet the 0.1% other atoms, like oxygen, iron, gold, are real and they matter, and thus elements of the periodic table are not binary. Like, trying to use the logic of saying, oh, intersex people are so rare, either ranging between like 2% to 0.1%, kind of depending on the definition you use. That's so rare, we'll just call those exceptions, sex is still binary. If you believe in that logic would also support the notion that elements of the periodic table are binary, because 99.9% of atoms in the universe are either hydrogen or helium.
That doesn't mean that every single human being is fertile. There are people that are infertile. Whether they are not fertile is not the point. The point is whether their reproductive system is fundamentally designed around the possibility of creating eggs or sperm. Every single human being would fall into one of those categories.
Their reproductive system was literally oriented around both. So you can't just say it's an either or. That's literally a lie. I don't know why we have to go so far to deny reality just to be transphobic.
Just let me say something here.
Oh.
And by the way, I almost chopped my finger off yesterday in the kitchen.
Wait, she's on this podcast. She's like, I almost chopped my finger off yesterday. Anyways, you can trust me about gender. Do not trust the woke liberal activists who do not cut off their fingers in the kitchen. You can trust me. I'm a real one. I cut my finger off and I tell you about it.
There are extremely rare individuals.
Wait, I thought you said it was all humans are either one or the other. Not that there are rare instances where somebody can be both.
These individuals at one time were called and they are now called intersex. And some of those intersex people, a minority of them, they may have both male and female elements in their reproductive system. And I have had a patient like that. So that person, you could argue, is truly an intersex, unclear.
This intersex person, you could argue, hypothetically, is intersex.
But the numbers of babies being born that fit into that category are extraordinarily rare.
Just to give a little context, 73,000 intersex babies born in the US every year. Like, they try to make out that this is something that, like, never happens or is exceptionally rare, but even by the lowest known estimates, we're getting almost 1,000 each year, and by the higher estimates, closer to 100,000 each year. Yeah, it's practically zero, right?
Fall within some sort of a spectrum of male and female, with male and female only being the two extremes at each end. But then there's an infinite number of points in between those two extremes.
Just like she said, that plenty of intersex people lean more so one direction or the other. We could paint a spectrum of people who fit, say, like, typical male characteristics over here, typical female characteristics over here, a spectrum of, mostly female, but has some intersex characteristics, to more middling intersex cases, to perhaps male-leaning in terms of total characteristics, still intersex, and then more closer to a typical male.
We have to validate all these possible identities.
You should validate the existence of intersex people. So intersex people often have unique medical needs because their sex characteristics are not what, doctors typically conceive of. This binary notion of sex that is objectively untrue, as even she conceded that intersex people exist. This binary notion of sex has been used to set standards for medicine, which, might work out just great for 98% of the population. But if you have, even mild intersex characteristics, that's going to impact your medical needs. A lot of medical conditions are linked to hormone levels, are linked to having or not having certain body parts, which intersex people may or may not unexpectedly have. And so, yeah, we should validate their existence, and we should give them the medical care that they properly, truly need. Yeah, PCOS is an example where essentially, like, women will have higher testosterone levels, and it can definitely be seen as an intersex condition.
Nothing is abnormal. These are all variations of human expression.
There's absolutely a tendency to over-pathologize intersex conditions. There are plenty of intersex conditions that literally have no negative impact on life expectancy, on physical health, etc. And so the fact that like our medical system sees these as diseases to be treated is actually quite dehumanizing, much like when the medical system used to treat gay people as like a disease to be cured. Gay people weren't harming themselves or anyone else just by being gay, and the same is true about plenty of intersex conditions. There has been a long-standing practice of like surgically altering the genitals of intersex babies who are born with more like ambiguous genitalia, which is entirely medically unnecessary and results in a lot of complications down the road. We should not be assigning gender at birth with a knife, because that's what doctors have been doing for decades. If there's a case where something's medically necessary, absolutely, we should help people out. If there's a case where somebody consensually wishes to alter their sex characteristics, go for it. But to do so non-consensually, that's the huge problem.
In the 50s, by John Money, psychologist John Money.
We were asked about, is gender real, and now she wants to talk about John Money? Okay, this is going to be a crazy video. Let's go.
He was a famous sexologist and psychologist whose main area of study were these individuals that I just described. And his main interest was in how is that assignment made? Now, there's the word assignment, okay? That's a big word, right? Assignment.
Did you turn in your homework assignment? I know that's a big word.
How are those kids assigned male or female when they're born? Okay, we're talking, this is the 50s, the 60s. You got to wrap the baby immediately in either a pink or a blue blanket. We don't have those pink. Right now we have, for a long time, those blankets.
Okay, so she's kind of waffling around, but the answer for how they did this, it was medical standard practice where if the length of the glands of the genitals was greater than an inch, they would be assigned male at birth. If the length of the glands of the genitals was under 3/8 of an inch, they would be assigned female at birth. And then anywhere in the middle were the cases where they performed surgery to move you from one category to the other. There's no like universal cutoff on the phallometer between when we surgically alter them in the male direction or when we surgically alter them in the female direction. There were people that had larger glands that were surgically altered to be female, and there were people that had smaller glands that were surgically altered to be male. If they ranked the phenotypic masculinization or feminization, there was no consistent standard for which doctors would assign them male or female at birth. It was literally a doctor making a choice with a knife.
So these were the cases that John Money was fascinated with. And he proposed that he introduced the word gender and gender identity to refer to our sex as separate from our genitals.
A bit of interesting word history here. Before the 1940s, the term gender was used strictly in a grammatical sense, as in referring to whether or not a word would have feminine adjectives or pronouns associated with it, particularly in languages which were gendered, like Spanish or French, for example, how all nouns will have a gender, whether or not the table is feminine or masculine, is it la table or le table? This is what gender used to refer to before then. In 1945, Madison Bentley, defined gender as the socialized obverse of sex. And Simone de Beauvoir's 1949 book, The Second Sex, has been interpreted as the beginning of the distinction between sex and gender in feminist theory. There were feminists talking about gender as a phenomenon distinct from sex before John Money. John Money did coin the term gender identity, but people had talked about gender as different from sex far before him, and also trans people had existed far before him. The first medical research on medical transition in trans people was done by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld in the 1920s and 1930s back in Germany. Trying to characterize John Money as the founder of gender, no, not quite.
And that we are born gender neutral. So that when we're born, even a normal child...
Did she just say even a normal child? It's so apparent that these anti-trans conservatives view intersex people in such a negative light. She's even a normal child, referring to people who are not intersex. That's horrible. Intersex people are also pretty normal, and they'd be a lot more normal if people like you didn't try to demonize their existence.
And John Money would say things like, Well, females,
seen this
they
guy on the TikTok?
lactate, they menstruate, and they gestate. Everything else is imposed by society, a social construct.
John Money's beliefs, which she mostly characterized accurately, was that of gender artifactualism, not just gender social constructionism. So to kind of explain the difference, like the idea that gender is a social construct just means that society created these notions of gender that are kind of arbitrary. Like, why is it that girls have pink as their color and boys have blue as their color? Like, this is an arbitrary choice that's not linked to anything objective. That society gave it meaning, and that it matters in society because society gave it meaning. John Money's beliefs, gender artifactualism, suggests that gender is entirely, merely a societal creation that is imposed on you, and that is the only thing that exists about gender. That there is no kind of like innate predispositions towards having like a gender identity, but rather that gender identity and everything that is gendered is a result of socialization. So John Money takes the even harder stance there, and he's been thoroughly disproven on that. Modern day gender theorists seem to have this notion that there's something innate about a gender identity, where it seems you really can't like convert somebody into or out of a gender identity. John Money, being a gender artifactualist, believed that gender conversion therapy would work. The tragedy case was him trying to do gender conversion therapy on a cis kid, and it didn't work. John Money's horrible experiment on David Reimer disproved this notion of gender artifactualism. Forcing somebody to live life as the wrong gender is harmful for them. That's true for cis kids, and that's what trans people face by default, unless we're affirmed in our identities.
That because that's the case, and we are all born gender neutral, that therefore a boy could be successfully raised as a girl and a girl as a boy. It all depended on environment. So this was at a time in society when there was a great debate going on, nurture versus nature.
This debate's still ongoing, but you can look at the research behind it, and literally everything that we think of in terms of this debate has been shown that, yeah, it's kind of both. It kind of depends, and there's no really clean way to separate something as 100% biological or something as 100% sociological. Ultimately, we are a complex combination of predispositions and influences, and a lot of these do seem to be pretty innate, like gender identity.
Why is that particular idea so important to them? I'm a psychiatrist, right? I'm a shrink. So that's what I do. I try to figure people out. I tried to figure out John Money. Why was this theory so important to him?
It's crazy how she can like say so many words and like convey literally nothing semantically. Like, I'm impressed by that talent, how she can say so many words yet like provide so little meaning about anything.
When he did his research, this experiment on this theory, and the results were negative, he refused to acknowledge those results. That's how important it was to him that his theory be proven correct.
That was John Money being a bad scientist. So he had a lot of ideas, and a lot of them were wrong. You come up with a hypothesis and you test it, and sometimes your hypothesis is wrong. It's so crazy how conservatives love to bring up the John Money case when it entirely disproves them on the notion that like people are being groomed into being trans or whatever, because the entire point of the John Money case was that no, you cannot groom a cis kid into being trans. It doesn't work.
Why was this so important to John Money, that a person has not only a physical sex, but a psychological sex, which is their gender?
That's not what he was wrong about. What he was wrong is that your psychological sex is entirely 100% the result of nurture. That's what he was wrong about. This notion of having a psychological sex or a gender identity has been backed up by the medical literature, especially in recent years. And the idea of it being more innate has been backed up in the medical literature in recent years.
John Money had a very difficult childhood. He was raised in New Zealand on a farm, and his father was a alcoholic.
John Money had an abusive father, and that's why trans people are bad? Is that literally like what we're trying to do here? She's trying to frame John Money as like the founder of transgenderism or whatever, but like even if John Money was connected to trans people in some way, which he really isn't if you look at actually his contributions, suggests that means that other things about his life means that trans people are bad is a logical fallacy, because it's just attacking like a person for things outside of the ideas that you want to attack. It's so besides the point is the problem.
And his behavior was completely unpredictable, as most alcoholics are. And little John grew up in a home in which John was a boy who was a small stature, and he was a thoughtful child, and he was not a stereotypical boy who was out there getting into fights and being aggressive. He realized that it might be better for women if not only animals, but men were gelded. Gelded, of course, meaning castrated.
That's interesting. I don't know if this is true, but okay. I don't see how this has any connection to trans people, but let's continue.
And he wrote that it might be better for women and better for the world if men were gelded.
Are we going to provide any context to that? Because, like, is the claim, like, hey, things like sexual assault are really bad, and maybe if, men didn't have testicles, there'd be less sexual assault? Because I think that you can, at least have a thought experiment like that without it being, like, a heinous thing. Or was he just like, I want to see men have their balls chopped off and see if they become women? Like, I don't know if this is just some kind of, like, shower thought, and we don't know, like, exactly where it comes from. I don't know, it just seems kind of strange to just, like, dive so deep into a random one-off childhood thought that doesn't seem to be, like, really expanded upon in a way that we can really tell, like, intent or anything meaningful about trans people, let alone John Money's research on cisgender identity.
You're feminist.
Now, he also wrote, and this is most telling.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
John Money wrote, I bear the evidence of man's vile masculinity.
Kind of makes sense why somebody who had, like, an abusive father would believe in a notion that, hey, there are some, like, masculine coded traits, such as trying to solve problems with violence, that are toxic, that hurt men, in addition to hurting other people. And it's awful that our society often encourages them or condones them. Her argument that she's trying to establish is that John Money, founder of transgenderism, was a bad person, therefore trans people are bad. But she's failed to establish that John Money is the founder of transgenderism. And she's also just shown that John Money was a really complicated person that dealt with a lot of abuse. And that's why, he had some perhaps outbursts or strange thoughts.
If we were to diagnose John Money today, we would say he could have had what we call gender dysphoria.
Wait, what? She's trying to take his statement, the toxic masculinity of his father was, like, harming him, and he sees that, like, this is a societal problem, to him saying, penis equals vile, transgender me. Recognizing when masculine coded traits are used to harm and abuse people is not a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And the fact that she would suggest that somebody recognizing how their abusive father and masculine coded abuse is harmful is the same thing as having gender dysphoria shows that this person is a quack doctor.
He could have had what we call gender dysphoria, which is an aversion, a feeling of discomfort, severe discomfort with your genitals and with your biological sex.
John Money didn't even say he was severely uncomfortable by his genitals. He said he was uncomfortable with toxic traits of masculinity. By that logic, every feminist is secretly a trans woman. All male feminists are trans women. I don't make the rules. Fellas, if you like women, if you support women, if you think that patriarchal gender roles harm men, you're actually a woman. This quack doctor says so. Sorry, I don't make the rules. The thigh highs, the cat ears, they are being shipped to your door as you speak. Feminist men, the estrogen pills, you cannot escape this. You are forcibly being transgendered. Sorry, that's life now. Welcome to womanhood, sweetie. It's crazy the lengths they have to go to make insane arguments.
What I would say is the problem here is not that gender doesn't exist. It's saying that gender or gender identity is primary is more important than your physical identity.
Both are important. I don't think it's a fair characterization to say that one is important and not the other, to like be a characterization of trans people's thoughts, because like trans people recognize that both the psychological aspects of gender are important, as well as biological sex is important, as well as, you know, how society imposes and expects certain gender behavior, certain gendered attributes that are often pretty arbitrary. Like, we recognize all of these things are real and have real impacts. Like, that's why trans people tell our doctors that we're trans so that we can get the right medical care. You know, if the doctor is aware of like how trans people's bodies function with respect to like medical transition.
Everyone has to, you know, bow down and gesticulate to their own or others' perception, their own or, perception of their gender identity, that is primary. And even if a child is 5 years old, that if the moment that boy says, I'm a girl, we're supposed to all say, okay, you're a girl. What name do we use? What do you want to wear? Let's grow your hair out.
That's pretty much not even how like gender psychiatrists would do that. If somebody says that they're a girl at like age 5-year-old and they're trying to talk to a gender psychiatrist, what they're typically going to ask them is about, okay, what does that mean to you? You know, what would you like to do to express that? How would you like to express that? Is there, you know, do you want to express yourself with different clothing or like with a different name or different pronouns? Like trying to help them understand, hey, there are options out there. You can explore your own identity, and that, you know, whatever you decide on, that's okay. You know, if you find out that, hey, you're trans and you want to go by, say, a different name or something, that's cool. You do you. If you decide that, you know, maybe you just are a little bit more feminine in your expression, that's okay too. Like this characterization that you're immediately instantly trans the moment you express some kind of gender nonconformity is literally just not true. Like, gender therapists will encourage you to explore your identity, explore your expression, and just figure out what feels right.
That they are not going to pay a price for that, for denying their biological sex. That is my argument.
But that's not even denying your biological sex. To have a feminine name and you tell your doctor, hi, I'm trans. I might have some unique medical needs because I'm trans, but I go by a feminine name. Like, that's literally acknowledging your biology. And also, like, telling a doctor, say, if you've medically transitioned, I'm a transsexual, I have medically transitioned, I have unique medical needs, that is quite literally acknowledging your biology.
This idea, and it is simply an idea. It's not hard science. It's not something we can measure. Okay, biological sex, we can see it. We see it under the microscope. Okay, you see the chromosomes.
You can measure characteristics, but those don't always paint a complete picture. For example, you might see somebody that has XX chromosomes, yet has a penis. This happens in the case of, say, like, de la Chapelle syndrome. If you want to measure, like, psychological characteristics, or, like, if you want to measure somebody's identity, I mean, you kind of do have to ask them, but that still is measuring identity. It's a bit more of, like, a soft measurement, as is any kind of, like, psychological measurement or psychiatric measurement, but it's still a measurement nonetheless.
Gender is not something that we can measure. We can at least not measure it in a way that's consistent with the scientific method.
You can conduct studies, sociological studies, which are based around the scientific method, as well as like medical studies on trans people, on medical transition, on trans identity. This is the exact same way we do the scientific method for like measuring the phenomenon of depression, or say like measuring how effective an antidepressant is at treating depression. Measuring people's gender identity and gender dysphoria and treatments of gender dysphoria is quite analogous to applying the scientific method to something like depression. You know, is the rise of like social media contributing to trends in depression? It's actually quite often for sociological studies to analyze how certain medical conditions are linked to changes in society. The rise of anorexia was linked to a lot of social changes, particularly in how like women's bodies were presented, both in advertising and in society at large, where like women enjoying food was like often framed as like a dirty little secret kind of thing. And this was linked to increases in anorexia in women, like at a societal level. All of these were based on the scientific method of coming up with a hypothesis, conducting tests to see how the hypothesis stands, collecting data. This happens all the time.
Gender would fall into the area of soft science, not hard science.
She's a psychiatrist. Like, a lot of the stuff she does concerning mental health conditions are also soft science. You're not immune to this, gross man.
Fast forward to 2023, and it feels that this ideology is everywhere. It's exploded in popularity. It's now being regurgitated as fact. Why is that?
Oh my gosh, they're so slimy. Like, they're trying to say that, like, the modern trans movement are people that, like, believe in John Money's ideas. But modern day trans people do not believe in John Money's ideas. Modern day trans people agree that forcibly transitioning cis kids is bad and it harms them. Forcibly transitioning a cis kid is like what trans people go through if they're not affirmed. Forcibly transitioning a cis kid means growing up in a gender role which is not right for you, which doesn't feel right, having to live with your body physically changing in a way that feels wrong and foreign and incongruent with your identity. That's what trans people experience by default, and we don't want cis people to have to be forced to go through that. We just hope that people would have the empathy that they wouldn't require us to go through that as well. And that's why we have things like puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones for trans people.
The ideologues on the left took hold of what Dr. Money was saying before David Reamer came out. The book that really publicized, well, there was a BBC documentary about him as well, but this all happened in the late 90s. The book that came out, published telling his story, is called As Nature Made Him by John Colapinto, came out in 1999. John Money, his whole life, never made any public statements regarding what happened. In other words, public statements acknowledging the disaster of his experiment.
Is that true? Because if so, like, that's bad science. Scientists should be able to admit when they were wrong. A negative result is a negative result. Oh, we found the quote about John Money that she said means that John Money was, like, trans? Okay, let's see. Yeah, that doesn't seem like a trans thought. That seems more like a toxic masculinity thought. Glad to know that she was absolutely mischaracterizing him. All right, we're about to have a massive trigger warning, but John Money was a pretty routine child abuser. Once again, she's trying to connect John Money to trans people. John Money, like, didn't work with trans people. He studied cisgender identity and was separately... To characterize John Money as representative of the modern-day trans movement is just absolutely ridiculous and untrue, especially because John Money was a gender artifactualist, and modern-day trans advocacy does not support gender artifactualism. The right's beliefs are closer to John Money's than the left.
This is a wicked guy. We're talking about a wicked person.
Yeah.
That's fair to say.
I think that's fair to say.
It is fair.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that Francis is trying to get at is, how does this person remain in all our lives to this day with his crazy theories?
He doesn't, though. His theories were disproven, and like, modern-day trans advocacy denounces his theories because we don't believe in forcibly transitioning cis kids.
You see, the way that they see this case of the twins is that this is how they spin it. Gender identity was male, and it was put upon him that he should be female. And so that's an example of how gender identity is primary. So they don't say biology. They say it's his gender identity, and the poor boy, his parents and everybody was trying to tell him that he's a girl, but he knew his psychological sex was that he was a boy.
Miriam, we've now, like I said, fast forwarded to 2023. This thing has exploded.
Oh my gosh, they're just trying to dodge that because, like, I think they recognized she basically just spoiled that she was, like, wrong about the entire argument. So we have to move on to a different question.
More and more children are identifying as the opposite sex. In your opinion, how have we got to this point?
Entire deflection because she was too close to getting it. That's so crazy. We had 30 minutes of setup only for her to debunk her own argument at the end. Amazing how they can get away with this.
I mean, we're the ones that come out and say what's a disorder and what is not.
Ooh, interesting point she's about to make about pathologizing. She was pro-pathologizing intersex people, and now she's saying that what we do or do not pathologize is determined subjectively like us by us, which goes to prove the point that, hey, like, pathologizing gay people wasn't right. Pathologizing intersex people wasn't right. She keeps debunking her own arguments.
We're now up to DSM-5, which was written in 2013. And so it's on our shoulders, right? Psychiatrists and psychologists get together, talk, look at the research. Well, they're supposed to look at the research and make a decision about what's going to be a disorder and what isn't. We knew in psychiatry for a long, long time that there were extremely rare individuals that had gender dysphoria, which is this intense discomfort with your sex. And we knew that they basically fell into two categories.
Oh no, is she about to go autogynephilia posting? Oh no, we're about to get deranged.
Little boys who at the age of 2 or 3 or 4 would come to their parents and say, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. I desperately, I want to grow a penis.
Hyper's in chat if you want to grow a penis.
If they are watched carefully and given support, the vast majority of them, if they go through puberty, normal puberty, not synthetic puberty, will outgrow their gender dysphoria. The other group of people that we always knew about were middle-aged heterosexual men.
Oh yeah, we are autogynephilia posting. Okay, so what she's doing right here before that was she was weaponizing bad understandings of persistence desistance studies. She provided like an appendix of her anti-trans book where she cites this study on like persistence desistance. Actually, there's 2 that she cites. These have severe methodological flaws for trying to prove the point that like trans people shouldn't exist or shouldn't transition, etc. The first one that she cites was a follow-up study of boys with gender identity disorder. If you can immediately notice the problem is that this was a study about boys, as in people who later in life, as adults, identified as boys, weren't trans. By the way that they set this up, and also the definition of gender identity disorder back then could include people who were just gender nonconforming. So gender nonconforming boys who identified as boys as adults are not trans. Yes. Duh. The other study she cites was the one by... it was this one. So the main problem with this study, essentially they took participants who went to this gender clinic, and then they only surveyed the ones who didn't like go through with any transition, who didn't identify as trans as adults, and were trying to determine whether or not their gender dysphoria or gender incongruence in any kind of like, way of expression or identity, etc., persisted into adulthood. And as it turns out, the people who didn't transition were boys. Like if you're a cis boy and you didn't transition, you were likely to identify as a cis boy. So they just entirely ignored the portion of the population who transitioned and said, look, everybody didn't transition. But that's because their sample was just the people who didn't transition. It's crazy how bad this methodology is. Like, we surveyed people who didn't transition, and they're not trans, is what they did. But if you look at the studies, which even one she cites in her own thing, 97% still identified as trans. And these were those who actually did transition. Her own studies debunk her so fast.
Enjoyed cross-dressing, and after having families, would sometimes make the decision to live the rest of their lives as a female and perhaps get the medical treatment. So those were the 2 groups. So there was a diagnosis in the DSM called gender identity disorder. And what I just described to you about those 2 groups, they had gender identity disorder with the emphasis on disorder. In the universities and in sex education, big thing. I'm not going to have time to talk to you about sex education, but...
Yeah.
She's not going to go into her opposition to sex education. That's an interesting one.
Major influence and pipeline into these kids' minds. So all these changes were happening, and essentially, without psychiatry even putting their stamp of approval on the idea that gender identity is more important than biology, and that you can have an identity separate from your biology, at odds with your biology.
David Reimer literally had an identity that was at odds with his biology. He was forced to biologically, medically transition, yet his gender identity was at odds with that. The David Reimer case, which she brought up, literally proves that this is possible.
That is not pathology. That does not represent psychopathology. That idea was already swirling around and was actually accepted.
By the way, this kind of discussion she's talking about, like whether or not is this pathology, is this not pathology? Around this time, the exact same conversation was being had about gay people, whether or not homosexual identity disorder was a medical disorder, was a pathology, or whether it was just a way that some people exist and was totally healthy. And the way that you tell is whether or not something like this is intrinsically, innately distressful, debilitating, etc. And the truth is that there are many trans people who don't experience their gender identity in a distressing or debilitating way, especially after they're able to transition. That's just definitionally not a pathology, not a disorder.
Was it a psychiatrist? It was a medical doctor stood up and gave a lecture on if you have someone that comes to your office and wants to go on hormones and get surgeries in order to live as the opposite sex, our job as doctors is to give it to them. Our job as doctors is not to, examine or do what they call gatekeeping, send the person for psychotherapy.
Okay, she is massively misrepresenting what gatekeeping looked like back then. I don't know how many of you have looked into the medical literature about what gatekeeping of trans identity used to look like. If somebody presented to a gender clinic and said that they were trans in the 70s or 80s, they would essentially do hardcore interrogation to try to figure out if you were one of the true transsexuals. That often involved horrible invasive questions about what were your sexual fantasies as a child or teenager, in what way, how did you masturbate, how do you have sex, really weird things to try to gatekeep who is and is not a true transsexual, to the point where it was trans people who might have had some kind of comfort with their penis, or a trans person who was okay having a penis would have been turned away. You had to have been somebody who wanted bottom surgery. That was deemed the only correct way to be trans, which is crazy because plenty of trans people love having bodies with mixed sex characteristics, and power to them. Trans people who knew that this was bullcrap essentially wrote up guides on how to pass the medical gatekeepers and pass it around amongst the trans community. So they would basically explicitly give you a manual on how to pass the medical gatekeeping, how to say what's the correct way you should tell the doctors that you masturbated, what's the correct way to tell doctors how you feel about topping your wife. It was to the point where this medical gatekeeping was useless because the trans people learned how to circumvent it, because it was all bullshit based off of a couple of really, really outdated cases.
Our job is to accept what they're saying and to rubber stamp their diagnosis and do what they wish. Now, that was back in 2006.
That's the move towards the informed consent model. Adults are capable of making their own decisions. If we inform adults about all of the effects of a treatment and its risks, all of the effects of a treatment and its risks, then they should be able to make a decision for themselves what's right for them. Plenty of elective procedures, even plastic surgery, for example, is informed consent treatment. Essentially what these doctors were saying is that, hey, this medical gatekeeping model is not serving the population that we're trying to help, and an informed consent model would be better. And all of the research we have on the outcomes of both models have shown that the informed consent model is a lot better for trans adults.
The pressure was very, very high, not only to eliminate this diagnosis as a disorder, but to take it out altogether. So that it shouldn't even be part of this manual of psychiatric disorders.
Most people that are pro-trans believe that there is utility in gender dysphoria as a mental health condition, as a medical diagnosis. Having something as a diagnosis, particularly when there is treatment which can help it, is really important for having legal rights to access that care, which is a big reason why so many anti-trans laws have been shut down by judges, by courts, because there is a medical diagnosis which is backed up by literally every major medical institution and shown that this is necessary medical care for this population. And so it is discrimination, legal discrimination, to deny them that. And that's why these bills keep shutting down.
A lot of the conversation we're having stems from the invention of this concept of gender. And if we were to say, yes, some people feel a discomfort with the biological sex that they are, and yes, that is something that causes them distress, that is something that they can seek psychiatric help for, and maybe for some of those people, living as the opposite sex may be the right solution. But that does not mean that this mythical concept of gender identity exists. Why can't we say that? Because you said to me you don't agree with that earlier. Why can't we say that? Is it incorrect?
The questions can't even be asked because there is a tyranny.
Ooh. Are you kidding me? He asked her a pretty poignant question based off of her contradictory ideological stance. And she's like, well, you can't even ask that question today. What a bad dodge. Boo. Do better.
But I'm asking you. I'm asking you.
Oh, well, of course, that is of course, what you just said is correct, that we have to acknowledge that there are rare people, they used to be rare, that do have this disorder, and they deserve our compassion, and they deserve our understanding. And yes, some of them, yes.
Okay, so she's gonna take the, I care about the mentally ill transgender people.
Require these interventions. Absolutely they do. I'm not denying that.
So wait, if a trans person, would benefit from that treatment, like, can't we say they have a gender identity that is different than the gender they were assigned at birth?
Teaching preschoolers, 3-year-olds, that they may have been born in the wrong body, and that's perfectly normal, and that if they, and that if they wish to, live as the opposite sex, and they wish they would rather be boys or you get to pick, and whatever you pick, we're going with it. All the adults are going. I mean, this is just, it's just appalling. It's astonishing. It's, I don't know that I have the right words to express how destructive this is.
If you recognize that cis people also have a gender identity, then what's the problem with that? Cis boys know that they're boys. Like David Reimer knew that he was a boy. And so including him in the decision process, of an age where he can express that, which tends to be a little bit older than preschool, at the very least. Like, including that conversation, people can choose what clothes they want to wear. How is it that different for them to choose or to, identify what gender is best for them? Like, she's just acting appalled by it, but she hasn't explained any how that this is harmful. It's actually very healthy for kids to explore their identity, ranging from trying out new aesthetics, presentations, even to, imaginary play. All of this kind of stuff is good for kids' development, helping them develop both a sense of identity, a sense of knowing what feels right, and a sense of imagination. Those are all good things for kids to explore. And also for kids to explore trying something new and being comfortable with it not being right. Like, hey, maybe a young kid's exploring their gender identity and they try something, they're like, that's not really right for me. And they're able to healthily engage with that. That's a really good developmental pattern.
To a little child, to introduce in their minds the idea that they may be in the wrong body, that is destabilizing, that is destructive.
You can tell kids that different types of people exist, and that doesn't make them that type of person. That would also assume that just being trans in and of itself is a bad thing. The only problems that trans people face as a whole are caused by society demeaning us, denying us our identities, trying to deprive us of access to medical care, of access to social support. That's what hurts trans people. And so if our society was just accepting about trans people, then there shouldn't be anything better or worse about being trans or cis.
This is not what we should be doing for our children. But let me just add, I'm sorry, I didn't finish with the DSM. So there were people that felt it needed to be completely removed. So why was it kept in? And I'll explain why it was kept in. It was kept in because the doctors who were involved were compassionate. And they felt badly. They felt empathy for their patients and for these individuals who have difficult lives. And there is stigma against them.
I wonder why there's stigma against them when, you're trying to compare their existence to, John Money. You're literally the part of the reason why there's stigma against trans people. And you're identifying that the stigma is the harm, not the transness in and of itself. She keeps disproving her own points. She keeps doing it. Because she was just it's so bad that kids might think that they're trans, and now she's the problem with being trans is the stigma.
Taking out the disorder category, and no longer calling it a disorder, but emphasizing instead of the identity part of it, the incongruence of the identity, they are emphasizing the distress that they feel. So they shifted the focus.
If you want to have the actual nuanced conversation, kind of what she's referring to is the difference between the medical disability model and the social disability model. The medical disability model would say that there is something wrong with you physically, and we need to fix that physical problem. Meanwhile, the social disability model would say that society not being built around people like you is what the real problem is. There's nothing really bad or wrong with you innately. So how we might understand these two approaches with respect to like a mental health condition, a medical disability model would say that there are things that are going to be physically, mentally just more challenging, and that we should look for like a cure for autism, kind of like Autism Speaks style borderline eugenics. Meanwhile, the social disability model would be like, hey, autistic people are just as normal and right to exist as allistic people, and the problems that autistic people face is because society was not built for them, with respect to environments that tend to be more overstimulating to autistic people, with respect to how allistic people who dominate society at large tend to communicate with each other in ways that autistic people have a harder time understanding, that if society was more accommodating and welcoming to autistic people, then autism wouldn't really be a problem for autistic people. If we're talking about like cancer, yeah, I think the medical disability model makes a lot more sense in that instance. Like, this is something physical that we can really resolve through physical treatment. And with respect to things like being gay, the social disability model made way more sense, that the problems that gay people fought were homophobia, not being gay. For trans people, I think there's probably a mixture of both, that in severe cases of gender dysphoria, there's some truth to the medical model that, you know, medical transition is what these people need, in addition to the social model, transphobia really contributing to the negative outcomes of trans people.
That is a fundamental denial of reality in biology. And at some point,
The fact that trans people desire to medically transition shows that they're aware of biology.
the medical industry, the psychiatric industry, they're going to face a day of reckoning, aren't they, Miriam? Because, to be brutally honest, there's a lot of young people and children who have had medical interventions that are irreversible and highly damaging, and which they shouldn't have had.
Medical regret exists for literally any medical procedure we perform ever. And the medical regret rates for trans procedures, for like hormones, for surgeries, etc., are all astronomically low compared to medical standards. It's pretty common for medical procedures to have a regret rate around like 10-14%. Gender transition consistently across the medical literature has a regret rate of 1-2%. Knee replacement surgery has a regret rate of about 20%. And it's often a medically necessary procedure. It's insane how low the regret rate of trans-affirming care is compared to literally every other field of medicine.
You know, the lawsuits have started. You had the Cass report and the closing, the imminent closing of Tavistock, the GIDS service. So the day of reckoning.
They all mention like the closing of the Tavistock gender clinic in the UK, when they literally closed it down because they were going to be expanding it out into more local centers. Like, they were saying, instead of having one singular overarching gender clinic, this can't really serve the needs of everybody. We're going to split off into a bunch of like local centers. And they're like, they did this because they don't want to do medical trans people anymore.
I have to say, I look forward to it. I've been waiting for it for a long time.
She looks forward to medical regret? That's pretty heinous. But also, it's not going to happen. The studies keep coming out, and they keep showing that regret for gender transition is astronomically rare. You can wait until you die, gross man.
The other reason that the diagnosis was kept in the DSM was in order for it to have a code for insurance purposes.
That's true about literally every medical condition. Having it in the DSM is really important for having insurance codes so that people can have their medicine covered by insurance. That's true about depression. That's true about ADHD. I mean, that's true about like in other like diagnostic manuals, not just the one for like mental health diagnostic manuals. This is true about medicine in general. And once again, she's criticizing capitalism here. She's criticizing for-profit medicine, which is something that I agree. For-profit medicine is bad, but people on the left actually are willing to do something about it, willing to do something like nationalizing the pharmaceutical industry, willing to do things like providing socialized medicine so that people can receive medical treatment if they need it, including preventative medical care. Conservatives literally only complain about for-profit medicine when it's trans people and not anything else, because this is a disingenuous concern.
What we haven't addressed is the young girls.
These types all believe that like Blanchard's bunk typography can like explain the existence of all like trans women, I guess, but then they don't believe in any kind of like typology for trans men. Like, it's pretty strange that they think that there's a typology for trans women, but there's no such equivalent thing for like trans men.
So we have a new group, a new demographic, as you mentioned, mostly girls, still a lot of boys. It's not like it's 90-10. It's more like maybe 60-40. There's still an awful lot of boys. So this new group, was only recently identified in 2018. We had Lisa Littman.
Does she think that trans men were invented in 2018? Because that's crazy. It is true that trans men were historically underrepresented in the medical literature and the medical research of trans people, as is, basically anybody who was assigned female at birth being ignored at large by the medical community. This is why, like, for example, we have seen, like, far less diagnoses of autism and ADHD in women, because a lot of the research just wasn't done on women. And so seeing the ways which autism and ADHD were more likely to present in women were less likely to be caught by the diagnostic criteria. Rates of autism and ADHD are actually a lot more gender equal than we used to think, because we started doing research on women. Trans men also did exist prior to 2018. The Lisa Littman paper, which she's citing, for those that don't know, was a survey of disapproving parents, where they were like, hey, do you believe that your child is actually trans? Or do you believe that they were swept up in a social contagion by the evil transgender cult? And the transphobic parents said, that explains it. My kid isn't actually trans. We were swept up by the transgender cult. What the Lisa Littman paper proved is that transphobes don't believe they're trans children. That doesn't mean that the trans children aren't actually trans. It just means that their transphobic parents didn't believe them. And so to try to use the perspective of the parents who were transphobic to say that trans children aren't actually trans is to ignore that entire population and their own experiences and needs.
It's just unbelievable what's going on. The resistance on the left to fight any shred of evidence that their theories and their beliefs about how to treat these kids is wrong.
Yeah, it's because it's not evidence. It's just like the deranged rambling of transphobes. Like the Lisa Littman paper wasn't evidence about trans people. It was evidence about transphobes. The people she surveyed were transphobes, not trans people. Like, if you have actual evidence of trans people, I would love to look at that. The other thing that she would cite, like the desistance studies, those were once again based off of people who didn't transition. The quote-unquote evidence about trans people she's talking about is not about trans people, it's about other people. The other thing about the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis that they all like to claim, a lot of the transphobic parents report that their trans kids didn't tell them about being trans until, like, much later in life. They feel like it came out of nowhere. And the reason why that is because trans kids of transphobic parents are really scared to tell their parents because they know their parents are transphobic. So they'll often hide their identity for years before telling their parents. And so that's why the parents feel like this came out of nowhere, when in reality, these trans kids were overhearing their parents saying really awful things about trans people and knew that they were not in a safe home to tell their parents about it.
They are led to believe that that if they don't feel comfortable with themselves, if they don't like getting their periods, they don't fit in with their friends, they're not stereotypical girls, perhaps they're attracted romantically to other girls. There's many different things that could be going on here. Well, then you might be a boy.
People are not saying that. Having discomfort around periods does not make you a boy. I have literally never heard that as a phrase. But having a consistent gender incongruence, yeah, that might make you a boy. And you should talk to a psychiatrist about that. But not this one, because she's going to try to look for literally any other way to deny your trans identity. Yeah, we're getting so lost in the sauce at this point.
Your status is elevated when you come out as non-male or female.
Okay, so now we're just being actually delusional. Suggesting that you have an elevated status upon coming out as trans, that's completely delusional. Trans people are overwhelmingly bullied and ostracized, especially growing up in school. Like, you can look at the statistics yourselves on bullying, harassment, etc., even like sexual assault. They all skew that trans people are hurt the worst by these phenomenon. I know that people love to say that, like, oh, you know, you can come out as trans and like the left is going to support you. Yeah, that's because society at large is pretty awful to you.
I don't use the word cisgender because that's part of the lexicon that I refuse to use. If you come out to your friends as being neither male or female, it's, you know, you're kind of an elevated status. And not only that, but you are no longer, you see, if you are a white, heterosexual, middle class or upper class student.
Okay, so before we get into a bad understanding of privilege, to suggest that like coming out as non-binary means that like kids are going to be nicer to you, it ignores like the entire history of like does she know about like attack helicopter jokes and all like the ridiculous stuff that are thrown at non-binary people?
You're an oppressor. I mean, this is a whole other subject, right?
One with which we're quite familiar, Miriam,
Yeah.
believe me.
Okay. So you don't want to be an oppressor.
Yeah.
You want to be oppressed.
Why would you want to be oppressed? The whole point of being a leftist is being like, oppression's bad. We should do something about that. People don't want to be oppressed. To try to assign like societal, systemic oppression to an individual is also a bad understanding of leftism. Leftists don't think that just a single white man existing is like active oppression. It's the societal systems, it's the legal systems, which have biases and prejudices, which generally, gradually favor certain types of people over other types of people that we talk about when we're talking about things like systemic injustice and oppression.
If you are a member of a sexual minority and, or another minority, you can't change your race. You can't change your socioeconomic status. You're not going to come out and say you're gay or lesbian if you're not. But to say that you're neither male or female, okay. I mean, after all, we're all mosaics. This is me speaking now. This is the truth. I'm not saying that this is what these kids say.
So similarly, wouldn't it make sense that you're not going to come out as trans if you're not? If you're not trans, why would you come out as trans? That makes no sense. Just like why... She acknowledges that it doesn't make sense for someone to lie about being gay, so why would someone lie about being trans?
I could wake up one day and be feeling more, I don't know, ambitious and aggressive and like, I'm going to go and do this. And I could say, oh, I'm feeling masculine today. Maybe I'm non-binary.
I mean, look,
that was my first thought when you joined the call, Miriam.
yeah.
But listen,
Honestly, like, there's not really anything to gain in lying about your identity like that. These identities are marginalized. So, I mean, people generally don't want to lie about their identity. It's pretty simple. Like, you don't really need to worry about that. I mean, if someone's being, like, clearly bad faith, you can question them. But in general, people tend to be honest about their identity. Like, if somebody tells you that they're a Christian, for example, we tend to just believe them at their word and be respectful of that. Yet when it comes to something like being gay or being trans, this side of the political aisle tends to, like, question or investigate that in a way that they would never do with someone's religious identity.
My 2009 book was considered, of course, politically incorrect. And so it was only picked up by organizations that are conservative, religious organizations.
Is she admitting the grift that, like, her books were only being signal boosted by, like, Christian right-wing organizations? That, like, they were using her as, like, a political pawn, and that's the only traction she got?
Sex education, finally, people are realizing that what their kids are being told is just, it's wicked. Again, we get that word back again.
Please explain. How is sex education wicked? How is, like, reducing teen pregnancy wicked? Please, I hope she elaborates.
I mean, what we're exposing kids to at a young age and the lies that we are telling them, not only about gender, about other things, but...
What are the lies? Please, I want to know.
People are waking up and parents are waking up.
I don't know if she's married, but I can tell you their sex life is not good.
I know in the U.S., I don't know about the U.K. Oh, by the way, did you know that I spoke in the House of Lords 12 years ago?
no, we didn't.
No, we
Yeah.
didn't. There you go.
How would you know?
Yeah. There's
so
a reason why the left dislike you, Miriam.
Right. So I spoke there about sex education, and oh boy, at that time, your sex education in the UK, it was even worse than ours.
She still hasn't given any kind of, like, evidence for how sex education is bad.
You had websites. I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I remember doing research into your sexuality education.
Oh, here we
there,
go. Let's go.
and going on to government websites, or NGOs, NGO organizations that are funded by your government. And there would be links provided to the kids that were on that site of where to go, like bars, where to go for gay sex.
Okay, so I'm guessing that this was not intended for children. If they have like links for here's where to go to a gay bar to have gay sex, children can't go to bars. So that seems clearly designated not for children. I mean, like, what is this, basically like a Google Maps for gay people?
I guess the question, and the reason I stopped you there is because I'm going to ask a question which it's an uncomfortable one. But
I know, but I didn't answer. Wait, do you want to answer?
But no, because it provides a link into the question that I'm going to ask, which I think goes to the heart of some of this stuff. When I have looked at some of these theories, when I have looked at the people who have put forward these theories, who have created these theories, there always seems to be a link. And if I'm wrong, please push back on me. I'm not putting words in your mouth. There seems to be a link between these types of theories and...
What types of theories are we talking about? If we're talking about like conservatism, then yes, I would agree. But if you're talking about like comprehensive sex education, is shown to reduce the potential for child abuse because it gives kids the ability to recognize what abuse is and to tell a trusted adult about it. If kids don't know what abuse is in that way, if kids don't know what sexual trafficking is, they won't know if they're being abused in that way. At an age-appropriate level, knowing what abuse might look like by their age is very important so they can be recognizing, oh, hold up, this person's trying to abuse me. I need to tell my parent about this. I need to tell my counselor about this. I need to tell a trusted adult and get help. She's pushing against the types of sex education that are shown to reduce abuse. I don't know how you can push against that type of sex education unless you are okay with abuse happening. Or if you think that like your Christian moral puritanism is more important than preventing child abuse.
I call what's going on with kids. Okay, so let's define what is. Growth is the emotional and psychological manipulation of a vulnerable person with the goal of exploiting them in some way in the future.
And sex education is shown to prevent that. So what's your problem with sex education?
Now, I believe that with all of our sexuality education and gender education, there is no doubt in my mind that there is sexual and ideological thing that's going on.
Within sex education, you need to provide evidence here because the evidence literally disagrees with you.
If you have a 4 or 5-year-old and they're in a preschool group and the teacher begins to discuss anatomically correct names for the body.
That is a good thing. Yes, young children should know the correct anatomical terms for bodies, and this is shown to prevent child abuse. The reason why, if there is a potential case of child abuse, and a child's description of the child abuse is, my uncle touched my cookie, instead of my uncle touched my vulva, the first case cannot be prosecuted by a court because there's plausible deniability, and it might not even be picked up by parents. The second case is unambiguously clear that something inappropriate is going on and we should, investigate and stop abuse.
But you see, when that begins, what happens? The message that the child is given, we can talk about these very private things at school. We should not feel a sense of embarrassment.
You should not be embarrassed by the fact that you have private parts. So you can mention that, hey, these are private and we don't share them with adults, while not teaching somebody to be embarrassed about them. You shouldn't be embarrassed about having a penis, but you shouldn't be showing your penis to others. That's what we want kids to understand about their bodies at that kind of age.
So that's called desensitization.
The whole point is that you're also supposed to mention that this is a private thing, that this is not to be shared with adults. She's missing the other key part of early sex education, which is in addition to knowing the anatomical terms of body parts, recognizing these parts are private, we don't share them with other adults. That would be inappropriate touch, and you should tell a trusted adult about that, because that's inappropriate. It can be very uncomfortable for teachers to talk about that subject because they know all the, moral puritanism that exists surrounding it and all of the crazy things that people like her are trying to claim. I mean, she's even having an uncomfortable time trying to talk about sex education herself.
And that's only the beginning. I mean, they're telling them about, by the time they're 10 years old.
What? I don't think they're talking about sex at 10 years old. Around the time when kids are going to start being interested in sex is when you should talk about the existence of sex and talk about how it's important to follow safe practices and to wait until you yourself feel ready and comfortable to have sex.
At such a young age, the child is supposed to deny their inborn sense of shame or let's say embarrassment. That's a normal sense of embarrassment. That should be there.
No. Like, shame around attraction, arousal, or like just being a sexual person is not something that's good to instill in kids. Her right-wing religion is seeping into her beliefs here. People are not naturally born with a sense of shame around sexuality. Shame is taught. Like, when adults shame teenagers for starting to experience sexual attraction, when people are made to be embarrassed about having private parts, like, these are the kinds of, or especially like far-right Christian rhetoric around, like, you know, your sexual urges are evil and they are sinful and they are like keeping you from God. These are the kind of things which instill shame in children. People tend to have worse outcomes when it comes to comfortability with their sexuality, when it comes to sexual functioning later in life as adults, the more shame they have instilled in them in development stages. Instead, you can teach teenagers as they're growing up that masturbation is a thing. It's a great alternative for sex because you can do it just with yourself and there's no risk of STIs, there's no risk of unwanted pregnancy, but it's a private thing that you should do, you know, by yourself, in private, not with like other adults or with like a trusted partner. You can teach them that it's private without it being shameful, and that's the best thing to do.
They get the message that it's not at home that I'm going to learn about these things. It's not my parents that are the experts that I need to go to for my questions. It's my school. It's my teacher.
Both can be helpful resources to go to ask questions. Like, they typically teach you that you can talk to trusted adults about that, like your parents. And to be fair, most parents are not licensed professionals with backgrounds in education, with backgrounds in human sexuality. And I think that school curriculum, which is developed by sexologists, that's developed by pediatricians who work with like child development, teenager development, etc., are going to be better equipped to approaching these conversations in a way that is healthy, that prevents abuse, than your average parent would. And that's not to say that the parents shouldn't have any kind of like input or inclusion in their child's education or in their child coming in with questions, but that, yes, having this baseline provided by a school, which has been backed up by professionals who write curriculum, is a good baseline for every kid to have, to help them approach these conversations with their parents better.
Yes, but it does, and I get what you're saying, and it's a very good point, but
They keep having to redirect because she's so bad at, like, articulating her points.
There is a link, and there's the link is to destroy any remnant of any Judeo-Christian.
What? Oh no. Wait. She thinks that the link between and sex education is an attempt to destroy Christianity? This lady must have so much sexual shame. She doesn't even realize the prison she's created for herself, and she wants to give that same prison to literally everyone.
One of the things you really wanted to talk about is, and briefly, is the impact that gender ideology and its consequences has on the entire family unit, not just the individual young person who goes through this. So
Correct.
Tell us in a couple of minutes what's going on there.
Okay. I mean, I'll just emphasize that my book, Lost in Transnation, is a book for families, for parents. It is not for professionals.
Hold up. She just said her book, which claims to debunk, like, medical science on trans people, is not for medical professionals. That's practically all but admitting that it's bunk. Like, she's literally like, oh, medical professionals, this book is not for you, because you have the knowledge to debunk all the lies I'm saying. Oh my goodness. Yeah, please do not peer review my work. No, medical professionals, do not look at it. It's not for you. It's for Christians who hate sex and trans people.
For moms and dads to be able to inoculate their families against these dangerous ideas before they have a problem. I have model conversations that you can have with your child a model conversation you can have with a therapist or the principal of your school.
Oh gosh, I wonder what those model conversations are like. It's like, kid comes to mom, hey mom, I think I'm attracted to boys. And then mom's like, you should be ashamed of that. Do not kiss boys. Do not hold boys' hands. God does not approve of that unless you two are married, so you better marry a boy or don't even think about it, buckaroo. Shame.
You know, we're all focused on the young people. Of course we are. Of course we're focused on them. They are the primary, that's ground zero.
You kissed a boy, straight to hell.
What I've seen over these years, talking to hundreds of parents, is this for many parents, almost, I would say maybe all parents that go through this, it is the most difficult and devastating experience they've had in their lives.
Having a trans kid? What if you were just, like, supportive? Like, literally, there are so many parents that, like, they have a trans kid, and they're like, oh, cool, thanks for telling me. Yeah, let's try to talk to your doctor about that, see if we can get you in contact with a gender therapist, and we'll figure out where this thing goes. We're gonna love and support you, no matter who you are, because we love you unconditionally.
I'm talking about parents who may have gone through cancer, financial ruin, divorce.
Oh, she's saying that having a trans kid is worse than financial ruin and divorce and cancer. Okay, wow. Wow.
9/11.
Wait. Having a trans kid is worse than 9/11? Having a transgender child is my 9/11?
What have you, COVID, and yet seeing their child be recruited by this ideology.
Okay, she literally is saying that having a trans kid is worse than 9/11. People died in 9/11. Lady, gross man. People died in 9/11. Trans kids live when they're supported. Holy, oh my god. I can't. From right-wing Christian religious beliefs are medical fact to having a trans kid is worse than 9/11.
And to watch what it does to their child as their child changes before their very eyes, even prior to any medicalization, they see their child changing before their eyes because these children change.
It's almost like recognizing a part of your identity which you were told to suppress and allowing yourself to freely express who you really are might allow yourself to be authentic in a way that you weren't before, and that's a good thing.
And they come under the influence of strangers, and those strangers place a wedge between the child and their loving and devoted parents.
The barriers that trans people face from connecting with their parents is their parents' own transphobia.
Parents who need to be reported to Child Protective Services. And trust me, as a child psychiatrist, I myself have reported families to Child Protective Services in the past, so I know all about that.
Now she's saying that you have to report trans kids to Child Protective Services. If you would love your kid only on the condition that they're cisgender, that is not being a loving, supportive family. Like, love for your kids, true love for your kids, is unconditional.
And their parents have the right, the constitutional right, to direct their child's upbringing, their education, and their medical care. Now, these ideologues, these people at school, pediatricians, Child Protective Services, like you said, it's everywhere.
It's totally like the right-wing Christian belief that children are the property of their parents. Yeah, it is absolutely the belief of right-wing conservative Christians in particular that they have physical property level ownership over their children, and that's why they feel so like entitled to their kids being cisgender, for example. Oh, speaking of like 17-year-olds choosing to get vaccines against their parents' wishes, I am actually one of those kids. Yeah, I got my vaccines updated as an adult because my parents were anti-vax, based an immunity pill. In the midst of all this, talking about how much, unsupportive parents that are trying to instill you with shame can really mess up your life. There is so much more life to live. Like when you turn 18, when you move out, when you do all of this stuff, like you can really change your life for the better. And there are so many opportunities available for you, especially if you're like going to college, for example, or establishing yourself on your own. And yeah, I got vaccinated. That was one that I did. I came out as trans. There is so much you can do to give yourself a better life. I know that a lot of teenagers, especially those that are like contemplating, self-harm, for example, kind of think that like, they're doomed from like their age or whatever. But I promise you, life gets so much better and so much more expansive when you become an adult, and you cannot imagine the possibilities that are available for you.
I just spoke to a woman. She lived in a country that a few decades ago they had a genocide. She lost her family and a limb, one of her limbs. This woman told me that going through what she's going through with her daughter, identifying as a boy and wanting to go on testosterone, has shattered her life more than the genocide did.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so wait. Did she really go there? Did she really go from having a trans kid is worse than 9/11 to having a trans kid is worse than genocide? I cannot believe she went there. Genocide kills people. The trans kid is still alive. Their gender's just different. If you love and support your kid, it's literally no problem. Like, if you just love and support your son, it's no problem. But the genocide is still a problem. Oh my goodness. This just keeps getting worse. I didn't think it was going to be this bad, but holy.
So
they're speechless. They're like, I don't think we can respond to this. Like, holy.
This has a ripple effect, not just parents, siblings, grandparents, cousins, and we didn't even speak about the other students in the classroom. What's the effect on other students in the classroom when suddenly they come back from their summer vacation and someone that they always saw as a boy is now they're supposed to, in their minds, think of as a girl. But let me just remind your audience that I am providing, this is the first book in existence written by a medical doctor that is providing parents with the information that they must have to understand this and to prevent, to do what they can to give them the tools to prevent this terrible, devastating damage from affecting their families.
I cannot believe that this lady still has a license. Jordan Peterson's gotten into some water lately, particularly surrounding his psychological license, where he has to go through like mandated training because of all like the hate speech and like going against literally medical standards that he's been doing on social media. It's absolutely insane that people like her can still have a psychiatry license. For those that were unfamiliar with her, she was also on like the Matt Walsh What Is a Woman documentary as like Matt's source for the claim that like John Money invented transgenderism.